There's a place in the Appalachian Mountains, not on any map you'd find at a gas station, not in any GPS, not in any travel guide, where the trees grow so thick and so tall that the sky becomes just a rumor, a thin blue suggestion between the branches, something you half remember, like a dream you had when you were very small. People in the nearest town, and that town was 40 minutes away on a dirt road that turned to mud every March and stayed that way until June. People there called it the Hollow, not a hollow, the hollow, like there was only one, like the word itself was a warning. Nora Callahan grew up in the Hollow. She was 23 years old, lived alone in the house her grandmother had left her, and she had never once in her life felt afraid of the forest. That was the first thing you needed to know about Nora. She was not afraid. Not of the dark between the trees, not of the sounds that came after midnight, the low, dragging sounds that most people convinced themselves were just raccoons, just deer, just the wood settling in the cold. Not of any of it. She'd grown up hearing her grandmother say, "The forest doesn't want to hurt you, child. The forest doesn't want anything. Only people want things. Only people are dangerous." Nora had believed that. For 23 years, she had believed that completely. Her house sat at the end of a gravel path that was technically a driveway, though it hadn't seen a car in 3 years. She drove a rusted Ford pickup that she parked at the base of the hill and walked up every evening, grocery bags in both hands, boots crunching on loose stone. The house itself was old. Not charming old, not rustic old. Old in the way that things get when they've absorbed too many years, too many winters, too many people living and dying inside their walls. The wood had gone grey, the porch sagged slightly to the left. The windows had that particular wavy quality of very old glass, so that if you looked through them at the wrong angle, the trees outside seemed to ripple, seemed to move, even when there was no wind. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Her grandmother had hung bundles of them from every ceiling beam, lavender and sage, and something else Nora had never been able to identify, something darker, something that smelled like earth after rain, like something that had been buried and dug back up. Her grandmother had called it keeping the house honest. Nora had never asked what that meant. Now her grandmother was gone, and there was no one left to ask. She worked remotely, data entry for a logistics company in Charlotte that she'd never visited in person. She sat at a wooden desk by the window every morning from 7 until noon, entering numbers into spreadsheets, and then she stopped. That was her workday. Afternoon, the hours belonged to her. She walked the forest. She tended the garden, mostly herbs, mostly the same ones her grandmother had grown, though she'd never really understood what half of them were for. She cooked simple things. She read until her eyes got heavy. She slept. She was, by most measures, lonely. But loneliness and solitude are two different countries, and Nora had always lived happily in the second one. Or she had, until the summer she turned 23. Until the summer she started hearing the sound. It started in June. A low sound, just at the edge of hearing. Something between a hum and a whistle. Something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. From the tree line, from under the ground, from somewhere behind her own sternum. She heard it first on a Tuesday night. She was reading in bed, the old lamp on the nightstand throwing orange light across the pages, and it was past midnight, and the forest outside was doing its usual thing, the crickets, the wind,
the distant something that might have been a fox, when the sound began. She put her book down, listened. It stopped. She picked the book back up. It started again. She went to the window. The tree line was 40 feet from the house, a wall of black between the trunks, and nothing was moving, and the sound was still there, and then it wasn't, and then the night was just the night again. Raccoons, she told herself, deer, the wood settling in the warm. She went back to bed. She did not immediately fall asleep. By July, she had heard the sound 11 more times. She had stopped counting after 11 because counting made it feel like something worth counting. She did not want it to be something worth counting. But on a Friday night in the second week of July, she heard it again, and this time she did not put her book down slowly, did not go quietly to the window. This time she was already at the window, because she had been watching the tree line. She hadn't told herself she was doing it. She just found herself there, sitting in the chair by the window after dark, not reading, not doing anything, just watching the trees. And when the sound came, she was watching, and something moved. At the very edge of the tree line, at the place where the moonlight gave up and the dark began, something shifted. Not an animal, or not the shape of an animal. It was tall. That was the first thing. It was the height of a man, more than 6 feet, and it was standing upright on 2 legs, the way a person stands when they're looking at something from a distance and they don't want to be seen. Nora's hand found the window latch. She didn't open it. The shape stood there for a long moment, long enough that she began to wonder if it was just a trick of the moonlight, just a particular arrangement of shadows that her tired brain had assembled into a silhouette. And then it moved back, 1 step, into the dark, and was gone.
She told herself it was a hiker. The Appalachian Trail ran within 20 miles of her property. Hikers got lost. Hikers wandered off trail. It wasn't impossible. She told herself that in the morning, over coffee, in the reasonable light of a July sunrise. She almost believed it. Almost. 3 nights later, he knocked on her door. She heard the knock at 11:15 p.m., and she sat completely still on the couch for a full minute before she got up. Her grandmother had kept a shotgun under the stairs. Nora took it out. She'd never actually fired it, but she carried it to the door and she stood behind it and she said, "Who's there?" And the voice that answered was the most beautiful voice she had ever heard, low, even, unhurried. The voice of someone who had never once in their entire life needed to raise it. "I'm sorry to bother you," it said. "I've been walking a long time. I saw your light." Nora stood with the shotgun in her hands. "What do you want?" A pause. "Water," the voice said, "if you can spare it." She opened the door. She would think about that moment many times in the months that followed, the opening of the door. She would try to identify the exact thing that made her do it. Was it the voice? Was it the phrasing, "if you can spare it," that particular gentleness of it? Was it simply loneliness, the 8 months since she'd spoken to another human being face to face? She never came up with a good answer. She opened the door, and he was standing on her porch. He was tall, she'd been right about that from the window, well over 6 feet, dark hair, a little too long, a face that was, she would later struggle to describe this, a face that was almost right, like someone had been given a description of a handsome man and done an excellent, careful job of recreating one. High cheekbones, dark eyes, very dark, almost no distinction between iris and pupil in the porchlight, a mouth that seemed to rest naturally in something just short of a smile.
He was wearing a flannel shirt and dark pants and boots that had genuine trail mud on them. He looked like a hiker. He looked completely, entirely normal. "Thank you," he said when he saw her. Not "thank you for opening the door," just "thank you," like he'd already known she would.
She did not let him inside. She was not that trusting. She filled a glass of water at the kitchen sink and brought it to the porch doorway. And he took it and drank it slowly. And she stood in the porch doorway with the screen door between them and watched him. "My name's Cahill," he said. "Just Cahill? It's what people call me. Are you lost?" He smiled. And there it was, the thing she would think about later. The first thing that was not quite right. The smile went all the way across his face in a way that was technically correct. Technically what a smile looked like, but which lasted about half a second too long before it settled. Like he'd had to make a small adjustment. Like something had needed calibrating. "Not anymore," he said. He told her he'd been hiking for 3 weeks. Told her he'd come down from Vermont following the ridgeline. No particular destination. "You been sleeping outside this whole time?" "Mostly," he said. "Where's your gear?" She looked at him. "I travel light." She looked at him. No pack, no sleeping bag, no tent roll, no water bottle of his own, which was why, presumably, he'd knocked on her door. A man who'd been hiking alone in the Appalachians for 3 weeks with no gear. She should have closed the door. She did not close the door. "You can sleep on the porch," she said. "There's an old chair that unfolds. I'll get you a blanket." He was still there in the morning. She'd half expected him to be gone. Had almost hoped he would be, honestly. Because then she could have told herself the whole thing was fine and harmless. And she could stop thinking about the half-second smile. But he was there. Sitting in the folded chair, wide awake, watching the tree line. "Did you sleep?" she asked. He turned to look at her. "Some," he said. She brought him coffee. He drank it, though she noticed he held the mug strangely, carefully, like something he'd seen people do rather than something he'd done 10,000 times himself. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. "But you're going to." He looked at her with those very dark eyes. "Do you want me to leave?" She thought about it for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable. "Not yet," she said.
He stayed for 3 days. In those 3 days, she learned the following things about him. He did not eat much. She made eggs one morning, and he ate 2 bites and then left the plate. And when she asked if he was hungry, he said he was fine, in a way that suggested the question itself was slightly puzzling to him, as though hunger was something he understood in theory. He did not sleep, or barely slept, or slept in a way that didn't look like sleeping. She woke at 2 a.m. on the second night and looked out, and he was in the yard, standing perfectly still, facing the trees, not pacing, not wandering, standing, the way something stands when it is listening with its entire body. He was extraordinarily still. That was the main thing, actually, the stillness. Most people are in some kind of constant micro-motion, fidgeting, shifting weight, touching their face. Cahill was not. When he sat without moving. When he stood like something that had decided to be in that exact location and had no doubts about it. It should have been unnerving. It was, instead, oddly peaceful. Like being near a very old tree, she thought, like standing next to something that had made its peace with being where it was. On the second evening, they sat on the porch, and she opened a bottle of wine, and he held a glass of it, and she wasn't sure he actually drank any.
"Tell me something about yourself," she said. "What do you want to know? Anything. Where you're from, what you do, how old you are." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm from here," he said. "Vermont?" "No, here, this." He gestured at the trees, the dark between them, the specific quality of mountain air at dusk. "Places like this. I've always been in places like this." "That's not really an answer." "I know." She looked at him sideways. "How old are you?" The half-second smile again. "Older than I look," he said.
On the third morning, she found the shed skin. She went out early, before he was up, or before he was in the yard at least. She couldn't be sure he'd been inside. And she walked to the garden to check on the tomatoes, and it was there, in the grass along the garden's edge. Long, very long. Shed snakeskin, she thought, immediately, because that's what it looked like. The dry, papery, translucent casing of something that had outgrown itself. Except snakeskin came in segments, came in the diameter of a snake's body. This was wider. This was much, much wider, the width, roughly, of a human torso. She crouched over it for a long time without touching it. It was dry and pale, and caught the morning light in a way that made it look almost like old parchment, like something you could write on. She heard the porch door open. She stood up quickly. Cahill came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her, and looked at her face, and then looked at the ground in front of her, and something moved behind his dark eyes. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to guilt. Something like the feeling you get when you've left something out that you'd meant to put away. "That's not what you think," he said. "I don't know what I think," she said. He was quiet. "Should I be afraid of you?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. "That's exactly what something I should be afraid of would say." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." She did not ask him to leave. She has thought about why many times. She is a practical person. She is a person who makes sensible decisions. She is not, by any measure, naive. But she did not ask him to leave. "There is something I should tell you about Nora Callahan, and it is this. She had been lonely for a very long time. Not the ordinary loneliness of a person who doesn't get out much. Something older than that. Something that had been with her since childhood. This feeling of being adjacent to the world rather than in it, of watching people through glass."
She had never found another person who gave her the feeling of being genuinely met. Until him. Whatever he was, he met her in that particular way. He looked at her and she had the sense of being seen clearly, without judgment, without performance. The way you feel in deep woods, actually, when there's no one around and you don't have to be anything in particular. She knew that probably made her a fool. She stayed a fool. On the fourth day, she asked him directly. She was standing in the kitchen and he was leaning in the doorway. Always that stillness, that unhurried presence, and she turned from the stove and looked at him and said, "What are you?" Not a question, a demand. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "I think you already know. I want to hear you say it." "Why?" "Because I need to know if you're going to lie to me." He was quiet for a moment that stretched itself out. "I don't lie," he said. "It's actually one of the things I can't do, not convincingly." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He came away from the doorway, sat down at the kitchen table in that careful, deliberate way, like each movement was chosen. "I've been in these mountains," he said, "for a very long time, long before there were houses on them, long before there were roads." She waited. "I take different shapes," he said, "when it suits me, when it's useful. This one," he gestured at himself, at the flannel shirt and the long hands and the dark eyes,
is one I've used before when I want to speak to someone. To speak to someone, she said. Yes. You came to speak to me. Yes. Why? He looked at her, and something in those dark eyes was very old and very calm, and she had the sudden certain feeling that she was being looked at by something that had watched this mountain be a different shape than it currently was. You've been here for 3 years, alone. You kept the herbs. You kept the old ways, even though you didn't know that's what you were doing. She thought of her grandmother, the bundles of herbs, keeping the house honest. What does that mean? She asked. The keeping. It means, he said, that something is being maintained, a kind of agreement between the people in this place and the things that were here before the people. And you're one of the things. I'm the oldest of them, he said, not proudly, just as a fact.
She slept on it. Literally, she said, I need to sleep on that, and went to bed at 9 p.m. and lay there for 2 hours not sleeping, and then eventually did sleep, and in the morning she felt the strange peacefulness that sometimes comes after a long night of not sleeping, that fragile clarity. He was in the yard when she came out, facing the trees, still. Okay, she said. He turned. Tell me about the agreement. He told her, standing in the early morning light, in his careful, unhurried way, while she stood with both hands around her coffee mug. The families that had come to this hollow, this specific hollow in this specific fold of mountain in the 1700s, had found it already occupied, not by people, by something older. There had been fear initially, the usual fear, but her people, her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, going back as far as names went in the family, had been practical women, Appalachian women, which meant women who understood that the world was full of things that didn't fit comfortably into any category, and that you dealt with them the way you dealt with everything, directly, without fuss, with appropriate respect. An agreement had been made. The details were, he admitted, somewhat complex, but the broad shape of it was this. The hollow would be left as it was. The forest would not be cleared beyond a certain boundary. Certain practices would be maintained, the herbs, certain small observances that had been passed down as folk custom, as superstition, as grandmother's recipes for keeping the peace, and in return, the things of the forest would keep their distance, would respect the boundary between wild and kept. Your grandmother, he said, was the last one who truly understood the shape of it, who knew what she was maintaining and why. And now she's gone. Yes. So the agreement? Still holds, he said. You've been keeping it without knowing. The herbs, the way you leave the garden edge unmown, the way you've never cut into the tree line. She thought about that. She'd always told herself those things were just habit, just aesthetics, just a preference for a certain wildness at the edges. But it's fraying, he said. Without someone who understands it, these things fray. And when they fray... He stopped. What happens when they fray? He looked at the tree line. Things come closer, he said. Things that aren't me. Things that aren't interested in agreements. She spent the next several days asking him questions. He answered them. Not always fully, not always in ways that resolved into clean, simple sentences, but he answered them. What was he exactly? Old, he said. Old enough that the category doesn't translate well into words you have. Did he have a name, a real one? Many, he said, none of them in English. What did he want from her? A long pause. I wanted to meet you, he said. I wanted to see if you were what I thought you might be. And what did you think I might be? Someone who could understand this, he said. Someone who wouldn't run. She hadn't run. She thought that probably said something about her that she didn't fully want to examine. She asked him, one evening, to show him. He had been sitting across from her in the kitchen, and she'd been looking at his face, at the high cheekbones and the 2 dark eyes and the careful stillness, and she said, I want to see what you actually look like. He went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness, a considering stillness. "You're sure?" "I'm not," she said honestly, "but I'm asking anyway." He went out to the yard. She followed. It was a clear night, the sky actually visible above the small clearing, more stars than she'd ever seen in a city, more than she thought the sky was capable of. The moon was high and full, and the yard was blue-silver with it. He stood in the middle of the yard with his back to her, and then he was different. Not in a sudden violent way, not in any way she could catch the exact moment of. 1 second she was looking at the shape of a tall man in a flannel shirt, and then her eyes felt like they were adjusting to a new kind of dark, like the moment when you've been in a dim room long enough to finally start seeing the furniture, and she was looking at something else, something long, something that moved with a slow, weightless grace, the way very large things move when they have all the time in the world. She stood there. Her heartbeat was doing something complicated, but her feet did not move. She did not run.
He was back in a moment. She still couldn't catch the moment of the change, standing in the moonlight in the flannel shirt, watching her. "Okay," she said. Her voice was entirely level. She was proud of that. "Okay," he agreed. She thought about it. "That's actually very beautiful." Something crossed his face, something that wasn't the calibrated smile, something smaller and less certain, something she hadn't seen there before. "No one said that before," he said. "Really? Most people run. I told you I wasn't going to. People say a lot of things." She looked at him across the silver yard, this thing that was old beyond her ability to comprehend, that had watched this mountain in its previous shapes, that had made agreements with her great-great-grandmothers. "What happens now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "That's a surprisingly honest answer." "I told you," he said. "I don't lie." She asked him to teach her. She didn't ask it lightly. She thought about it for a week in which he came and went, appearing at the tree line, sometimes at her door, sometimes simply already in the yard when she woke. And at the end of the week, she asked, "The herbs, the old ways, whatever my grandmother knew, I want to actually learn it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I live here," she said. "Because this is my home. Because if I'm maintaining something, I want to know what I'm maintaining. It will take a long time. I'm not going anywhere." He began to teach her. It was nothing like she expected. She'd half imagined something dramatic, rituals, incantations, something you'd see in a movie. Instead, it was almost mundane, the practical knowledge of very old women. Which herb kept what at bay, not because of magic exactly, but because the things that lived in the old forest had long memories and long grudges and long associations, and certain smells meant this is a maintained place, this is a kept place, move along. Which nights required which small observances, not ceremonies, nothing theatrical, just specific acts done in specific ways, leaving a bowl of clean water by the garden edge, walking the property line at certain times of year, saying certain words, not in any language she recognized, and he taught her those words carefully, phonetically, telling her the meaning of each one. "What language is this?" "Older than language," he said. "Shape and sound before words had meaning." She said the words badly at first, and he corrected her without impatience, the way a good teacher corrects, not making her feel foolish, just showing her the difference between what she'd done and what was needed. She got better. In the evenings, they sat on the porch. She stopped keeping the shotgun by the door. She never made a decision about that. She just noticed one day that she hadn't thought about it in weeks. They talked about the mountain, about the things he'd seen on it, about her grandmother, about Nora's childhood and what she remembered of the old women and their old knowledge. He listened well. He asked questions that made her realize he was genuinely curious about her, about the particular texture of one human life, about the particular way the years felt when you were moving through them rather than watching them from the outside. "Does it feel fast?"
he asked once. Human time. She thought about it. Sometimes, she said, the years go fast, the nights go slow. He nodded slowly, as if filing that away. The years went fast for me too, he said, for the first several hundred. She laughed. It occurred to her that she laughed more than she had in a long time. She did not at any point tell anyone. There was no one, really, to tell. Her mother was gone. She had a cousin in Knoxville she texted on birthdays. She had co-workers in Charlotte she'd never met. But there was also something else, something she recognized as a kind of protectiveness, not of herself, of this, of whatever this was. It was hers. It was the Hollow's. It didn't belong in the light of anyone else's understanding. Late one August night, she asked him the question she'd been holding for weeks. They were in the kitchen. She'd made tea. He held his mug the way he always did, carefully, respectfully, like an object he was honoring rather than using. "Do you feel things?" she asked, "like what I feel, emotions?" He considered it. "I feel things," he said. "They don't have the same names. They're not organized the same way yours are, I think. But, yes. What do you feel right now?" Another pause, one of his long, honest ones. "Something I don't have a word for in any language I know," he said. "Something like a door I've walked past many times, and one day it was open, and I walked through it, and on the other side was..." He stopped. Was what? Something I didn't expect to find. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the dark eyes and the careful hands, and the face that was almost right and had become, in the months of knowing him, entirely, specifically, his. "Yeah," she said, "me too." The summer became fall. The fall became the specific Appalachian fall that people drive hours to see, the red and gold of it, the particular cold smoke of October in the mountains, the way the light comes through the canopy at a lower angle and makes everything look like an oil painting of itself.
Nora kept the herbs. She walked the boundary. She said the old words. She was good at it by now. Better, he told her, than anyone had been in 2 generations. "How can you tell?" she asked. "Things are quieter," he said. "The other things. They've settled back." "Is that good?" "It's balanced," he said, "which is what good means out here." He told her one October evening that he would have to go. Not forever, not in any way that meant something final, but the mountain was long, and his range, the word he used was something else, something in the older language, but she understood it as range. His range extended far past her property, past the hollow, past the ridge she could see from her east window. "How long?" "I don't measure it that way." "Try." He thought about it. "Before the first snow," he said. "I'll be back before the first snow." He left on a Tuesday. She watched him walk to the tree line, and then he was not there anymore, not in any way she could track. One moment there was the shape of a tall man with dark hair at the edge of the forest, and then the morning light shifted, and there was only the trees. She stood on the porch for a while. Then she went inside and made coffee, and sat at her desk and opened her spreadsheets. The numbers needed entering. The mountain remained. She found herself talking to the forest, not in any way she thought was foolish, not expecting answers, not thinking there was some general sentience out there listening, but in the way of maintenance, in the way of keeping. Walking the property line in the evening, she narrated the day. Small things. The tomatoes were done. She'd ordered new books. There was a hawk that had been hunting the meadow edge all week. It felt like keeping a house honest, like saying, "I'm here, I'm paying attention, this place is tended." She understood her grandmother in a way she hadn't
when her grandmother was alive. She thought about that on the long evenings, with the fire going and the wind in the pines, and she thought, this is what it means to be from somewhere, not where you were born, where you've made yourself accountable. The first snow came on a Sunday in November. She awoke to the white silence of it, that particular hush that snow makes, the way it cancels ordinary sound and leaves something more fundamental underneath. She made coffee.
She stood at the kitchen window and at the tree line, standing in the new snow with his dark eyes and his careful stillness, looking toward the house, Cahill. She raised her mug in a small acknowledgement. He raised a hand. She went to the door. There are places in the Appalachian Mountains that aren't on any map. Hollows and folds in the ancient stone where the trees grow impossibly thick and the sky becomes a rumor. And in some of those places, if the old agreements have been kept, if the herbs are correct and the boundary is walked, and someone says the old words with the proper understanding of what they mean, something keeps its distance. Something enormous and old and patient. Something that has made its peace with certain doors being closed. But in other places, rarer places, particular places, places where the right person has been living in the right way for long enough to have earned a different kind of relationship, the doors open, and something walks through it. And what happens in those places, in those houses, in those long winter evenings with the fire and the snow and the two presences in one kitchen, that belongs to the hollow. That belongs to the old agreement. That is not for any map.
It's 1922, Newark, New Jersey. A young woman is getting ready for a night out. She's 19 years old. Her name is Grace, and tonight she wants to look special. So she does something a little playful. She paints her teeth with the stuff from work. She paints her fingernails, her face, even her dress. And when the lights go out, she glows. Bright, beautiful, ethereal green. Her friends laugh. Her date is amazed. She feels like magic. What she doesn't know, what none of them know, is that the substance coating her skin, her nails, her lips, her teeth, is slowly killing her. And the men who gave it to her, they knew. They always knew. Welcome back. Today we are going deep into one of the darkest, most deliberately hidden stories in American history. A story about young women who were told they were painting the future and were instead handed a death sentence. This is the story of the Radium Girls. And by the end of this video, you're going to be angry, you're going to be heartbroken, and you're going to remember their names.
To understand what happened to these women, you need to understand what the world thought radium was in the early 1900s. Short answer? They thought it was a miracle. Marie Curie had discovered radium in 1898, and when scientists realized it glowed in the dark, this beautiful, ghostly, greenish light, the world went absolutely wild for it. This was an era before we truly understood radiation, before Geiger counters became standard, before anyone had mapped out what invisible energy could do to a human body from the inside out. What people saw was a mysterious element that glowed, that gave off heat, that seemed to have endless energy. So naturally, the early 20th century decided, let's put it in everything. And I mean
everything. Radium water, radium chocolate, radium face cream, radium toothpaste, advertised as making your teeth whiter and your smile more vibrant. There was even a radium-infused contraceptive jelly. One company sold a ceramic crock called the Revigator. You filled it with water. The radium in the walls would energize the water overnight. The instructions said to drink 6 or more glasses a day. People genuinely believed radium made you healthier, more vigorous, more alive. So when the United States Radium Corporation opened a factory in Orange, New Jersey in 1917 and started hiring young women to paint watch dials with radium paint, it wasn't seen as a dangerous job. It was seen as a good job. The pay was excellent, far more than most women could make in a factory at that time. The work was considered skilled. It required a steady hand and a sharp eye. The girls who were hired were proud. They called themselves dial painters. And the glowing paint they used, the company had a name for it. They called it Undark. Should have been a red flag, maybe. But back then, it just sounded magical. The dial painting studio was actually a nice place to work by the standards of the time. It was light and airy. The girls sat at long tables, bent over tiny watch faces, painting the numbers and hands with fine-pointed brushes. There was laughter, gossip, friendships formed. There were hundreds of them, mostly young women, some as young as 14 or 15. Many were recent immigrants or daughters of immigrants, Irish, Italian, Polish families, working-class girls who saw this job as a genuine opportunity. The paint itself was a mixture of radium, zinc sulfide, water, and glue. And it had one small technical problem. The brushes kept losing their fine point. So the supervisors, following official company technique, taught the girls to do something called lip pointing. You put the brush between your lips. You use your tongue and lips to reshape the bristles into a sharp tip. Then you dip it in the paint. Then you paint the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. Over and over. All day. Every day. Each time they did this, they ingested a small amount of radium paint. Now here's the crucial thing. The people at the top, the executives, the scientists employed by the company, they knew about the dangers of radium by this point. The evidence was starting to build. Radium's energy didn't just pass through matter. It damaged it. It broke apart cells. It interfered with the body's ability to repair itself. Workers at other radium facilities were getting sick. And the United States Radium Corporation's own scientists, they wore lead aprons. They used lead-tipped tools. They handled radium with forceps, never with bare hands. But the dial painters? They were told the paint was harmless. They were told it was good for them, even. One supervisor reportedly told the girls that swallowing a little radium would put roses in their cheeks. So the girls laughed and joked about their glowing fingers. They painted their nails with the stuff after hours. Some painted their faces to surprise their boyfriends. They took the magic home with them, without even knowing it. And inside their bones, because radium behaves a lot like calcium in the human body, it was quietly, methodically making itself at home. The body, confused by the similarity, absorbed radium just like it absorbed calcium, stored it in teeth, in bones, in bone marrow. And there It began to fire off radiation. Not once, not occasionally, constantly, for the rest of their lives. By the early 1920s, the girls started getting sick. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, the way the worst things always do. The first sign for many of them was their teeth. Toothaches that wouldn't quit, abscesses that formed for no clear reason, dentists who were baffled because these were young, otherwise healthy women. Their teeth shouldn't be rotting out of their heads. But they were. And then, when the dentists pulled those teeth, what happened next was almost incomprehensible. The jaw didn't heal. Instead, it crumbled. The bone, saturated with radium, had become fragile and rotten. It would develop holes, abscesses, strange growths. In some cases, doctors could press on a woman's cheek and feel the bone literally move beneath the skin, because it had broken apart on the inside. One doctor described it this way. He could remove entire sections of jaw with his bare hands. No tools needed. The bone just came away. Meet Molly Maggia. She was one of the first to fall seriously ill. She'd been a dial painter at the factory, a good one. She started complaining about a toothache in 1921. Within months, the infections had spread through her jaw, then through the bones of her face, then through her skull. The pain was extraordinary. Doctors had never seen anything like it.
By the time she died, in September 1922, at just 24 years old, her jawbone had been almost entirely removed in an attempt to stop the decay. It hadn't worked. Her official cause of death? Syphilis. Let that sink in. Molly Maggia, a young working-class woman dying of a mysterious, horrifying disease, was labelled as having syphilis, a disease that carried a devastating social stigma, a disease that implied moral failing. It was a lie, and it wasn't an accident. The company doctor who signed that death certificate, Dr. Edwin Lehman, worked for the United States Radium Corporation. He wasn't an independent physician. He was their guy. And as more women started getting sick, as the pattern became undeniable, the company responded not with concern, but with strategy. Deny, delay, discredit. They hired outside doctors to evaluate the workers and declare them healthy, even when they clearly were not. They suggested the women's illnesses were caused by other factors, lifestyle choices, prior diseases, bad luck. Meanwhile, the women kept dying. Hazel Vincent, Ella Eckert, Irene Rudolph, Albina Larice, Helen Quinlan. Name after name after name. These weren't abstractions. They were daughters, sisters, friends, women who had simply gone to work at a well-paying job and done what they were told. And by the mid-1920s, the doctors who were genuinely trying to figure out what was happening, researchers at Columbia University, for instance, were beginning to piece it together. The cause wasn't a mystery anymore. It was radium. But the company had known far longer than that. Documents would later reveal that by 1924, internal reports were confirming what the scientists already suspected. They'd done studies. They had data. They chose to suppress it. By the late 1920s, some of the surviving women decided they weren't going to go quietly. And that decision, made by women who were already dying,
who could barely lift their arms, whose bodies were literally disintegrating. That decision changed American history. The first major legal battle came from a group of 5 women in New Jersey. They became known in the press as the Radium Girls. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice. They sued the United States Radium Corporation in 1927, and it was hard. Not because they lacked evidence. The medical evidence was overwhelming at this point. Independent researchers had confirmed radium poisoning beyond any reasonable doubt. It was hard because the system wasn't built for them. Their case faced a statute of limitations problem. New Jersey law said you had to file a personal injury lawsuit within 2 years of the injury. But radium poisoning doesn't show up in 2 years. It takes a decade to manifest. By the time these women knew they were sick, the legal window had technically closed. The company's lawyers used this aggressively.
And the company itself was no small outfit. They had money, they had lawyers, they had connections. They stalled, they filed motions, they delayed hearings. Meanwhile, the women's condition worsened. Grace Fryer had a back brace just to sit upright. Catherine Schaub could barely speak. These women were attending court dates while dying. The press started paying attention, and suddenly public opinion shifted. Because there is something uniquely powerful about watching 5 young, dying women sit in a courtroom and demand justice from the company that killed them. The judge, sympathetic to their condition, agreed to expedite the hearings. He let them testify quickly while they still could. The case never went to full trial. In June 1928, the United States Radium Corporation settled. Each woman received $10,000, the equivalent of roughly $170,000 today. They also received $600 per year for medical bills for as long as they lived, which, for most of them, wasn't going to be very long. It wasn't a massive victory in dollar terms, but what it represented, that was enormous. For the first time, a corporation had been held legally accountable for knowingly exposing workers to a dangerous substance. For the first time, the idea that employers had a duty to protect their employees, not just from obvious accidents, but from invisible, long-term harms, was tested in court and upheld. And then there was Catherine Donahue. She worked at a different factory, the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. Her story ran a few years behind New Jersey's, because the illness took time to manifest. But by the mid-1930s, she was dying too. And she fought too. Even when she was so sick, she had to be carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. Even when the company argued with straight faces that she was making it all up, that she was a liar seeking money she didn't deserve. She won. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor in 1938. The ruling was upheld by the Illinois Supreme Court. Catherine Donahue died a few months later. She was 34 years old. But she had won. She had made them admit it. And somewhere in the paper trail of that case, in the court documents and depositions and scientific reports, was the foundation of something entirely new.
The idea that workers had rights. That companies couldn't just use people up and throw them away. That "I didn't know" was not an acceptable defense when you clearly did know.
Here's the thing about history that's easy to miss when you're just reading names and dates. Every protection you have at work right now, someone died to get it. Every workplace safety regulation, every requirement that companies disclose known hazards, every law that says an employer cannot lie to you about what you're being exposed to, someone, some group of people, usually people without power, usually people who had nothing to gain for themselves because they were already dying, fought for that. The Radium Girls are a direct line to the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, created in 1970. To the modern field of occupational medicine. To the legal principle that companies can be held liable not just for accidents, but for decisions. Deliberate decisions. The kind where someone sits in a boardroom, looks at a report that says our workers are being poisoned, and decides, we'll suppress that. We'll fight the lawsuits. We'll call them liars. We'll outlast them. Because they knew these women were poor. They knew they were young. They knew they didn't have lawyers on retainer. They knew the system wasn't built for them. What they didn't know, what they couldn't account for, was sheer, burning stubbornness. The willingness of dying women to spend their last energy in a courtroom, to put their names in newspapers, to be described in agonizing physical detail by medical experts, stripped of every dignity, all in service of making sure that some company somewhere had to admit what they did. The Radium Girls also left a scientific legacy, literally, because radium decays slowly. Its half-life is 1,600 years. The bodies of the dial painters are still radioactive today. Researchers have studied these women's remains to understand radiation's effects on human bone. Their sacrifice, involuntary, unknowing, horrific, actually contributed to the development of radiation safety standards that protect nuclear workers to this day. They didn't know they were giving that gift. They didn't consent to it. But somehow, even in death, they kept being useful. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, good, it should. Because that's the complicated, ugly, true nature of this story. These women were used by their company. Their deaths were used by science. And the only thing they chose, consciously, deliberately, was to fight back. That part was theirs. There's one more thing I want to tell you. In 2011, a young woman named Kate Moore was doing research for what would become her book, The Radium Girls. She visited the towns where these women had lived and worked. In Ottawa, Illinois, where Catherine Donahue and her co-workers had laboured, she discovered something strange. The contamination was still there. Houses built near the old factory sites, children's playgrounds, community spaces, all showing elevated radiation readings nearly a century after the factory closed. The Radium Dial Company had been gone for decades, but what they'd done was still in the ground, still in the walls. Some things don't clean up easy. Some things don't go away when the company closes, or the executives retire, or the lawyers move on to other cases. Some damage is permanent. And some stories need to be told again and again, not because they're comfortable, but because they're true. Because the people in them deserve to be remembered. Because when you know what
happened to Grace Fryer and Molly Maggia and Catherine Donahue and hundreds of women whose names we don't even know, you understand something real about power, about who gets protected and who gets sacrificed, about what it costs to fight, even when fighting is the only thing you have left. The Radium Girls glowed in the dark. They glowed in courtrooms, too. And they should glow in our memory. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it, talk about it. Leave a comment below telling me which part surprised you most. I read every single one. And if you're new here, this is what we do. We dig into the stories that got buried, the histories that got sanitized, the people who got erased. So subscribe, because there are so many more stories to tell. I'll see you in the next one.